There are buildings in this world that were never truly built by the people who owned them. There are walls that hold, within their stone and mortar, the memory of hands that were never paid, never thanked, and never free. And there are stories, buried so deep beneath the surface of official history, that it takes generations, sometimes centuries, before someone is finally brave enough to unearth them. This is one of those stories. It begins in the American Deep South, in the state of Mississippi in the year 1843. It begins with a mill, a river, and a man who believed he was building a legacy. But the real story, the one that matters, belongs to someone else entirely. It belongs to the people who were never given a choice, the people who carried the stones, who turned the wheels, who bled into the soil and were given nothing in return. And it belongs, above all, to a man named Solomon. Before we go any further, we want to ask you something. Do you know the name of someone in your own family, in your own history, who was forced to build something they would never own? Someone whose story was never written down, never honored, never told? Leave that name in the comments below, because today, right here, right now, we remember. The year is 1843. The state of Mississippi is, at this moment in history, one of the wealthiest places in the entire United States. Not because of its land alone, not because of its rivers or its climate or some natural generosity of the earth. It is wealthy because of a system, a brutal, deliberate, and legally protected system that transforms human beings into property, and property into profit. Into this world, on a morning in early spring, a man named Colonel Harlan Whitmore rides his horse along the eastern bank of the Pearl River and stops. He looks at the land, he looks at the water, and he makes a decision. He will build a mill here. Whitmore is 42 years old. He is tall, broad-shouldered, and carries himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was born in Georgia, educated in Virginia, and arrived in Mississippi a decade earlier with little more than his family name and a willingness to do whatever it took to build something permanent. By 1843, he has done exactly that. He owns nearly 2,000 acres of land along the Pearl River. He grows cotton and corn in quantities that make neighboring planters quietly envious. He is a member of the local church, a donor to civic causes, and a man whose name appears regularly in the pages of the regional newspaper, always in favorable terms. To the white society of central Mississippi, Harlan Whitmore is, without question, a man of vision. But vision, in the American South of 1843, is never built alone. The construction of the Whitmore Mill begins in the summer of that year. It will take 14 months to complete. The walls are built from dark stone, quarried from the land itself. The interior framework is heavy timber, cut and shaped by hand. The millstone, imported at considerable expense from a supplier in New Orleans, weighs over a ton and must be transported by river barge and then carried by human hands up a slope of nearly 60 feet. Every stone laid, every beam raised, every nail driven, all of it, every single piece of it, is done by enslaved people. There are, at the height of construction, 63 men, women, and children on the Whitmore property. They range in age from 7 years old to a man named Augustus, who is believed to be somewhere near 60 and who has been enslaved since the day he was born. They have been bought, traded, and in some cases literally torn from their families in other states and brought to Mississippi to serve a man who will never learn most of their names. They wake before sunrise. They work until the light is completely gone. And sometimes, on the nights when Whitmore decides the schedule demands it, they work by torchlight long after midnight. The mill, when it is finally completed in the autumn of 1844, is an impressive structure. 3 stories of dark stone rising above the riverbank, with a wooden water wheel turning steadily in the current of the Pearl. It can process hundreds of pounds of cotton and corn per day. It becomes, almost immediately, the economic heart of the surrounding community. Colonel Whitmore stands at its entrance on the morning of its opening and accepts congratulations from neighboring landowners, local officials, and a minister who blesses the building with a prayer of thanksgiving. Not one of the 63 people who built it is invited to stand beside him, but one of them is watching. His name is Solomon. He is 21 years old at the time the mill opens. He was born on a plantation in South Carolina and was sold to Whitmore at the age of 15, taken from his mother on a Tuesday morning while she was hanging laundry and told only that he was going to Mississippi. He never saw her again. Solomon is assigned to operate the millstone, one of the most physically demanding and dangerous jobs on the property. The work requires precision, endurance, and an intimate understanding of the machinery. Within 6 months, Solomon understands the mill better than anyone on the property, including the white overseer, who is technically responsible for its operation. But Solomon is doing something else as well, something that, if discovered, could cost him his life. He is learning to read. In the deep South of the 1840s, teaching an enslaved person to read is illegal in most states, including Mississippi. The law exists for one reason: because literacy is power, because a man who can read can write, and a man who can write can communicate, organize, plan, and resist. The people who built and enforced that law understood this perfectly. So did Solomon. He learns from scraps, from discarded newspapers left in the mill by the overseer, from the labels on sacks of grain, from a torn page of a Bible that he finds wedged beneath a floorboard and keeps hidden inside his shirt for 3 years. He learns slowly, painfully, in stolen minutes, in the darkness of the mill, long after the others have gone to their quarters. By the light of a candle, he has learned to make from leftover tallow and a piece of string. And as he learns, he begins to do something else. He begins to record. On the interior stone wall of the mill, in a corner hidden behind the large timber support beam on the ground floor, Solomon begins to write. Small letters. Careful, deliberate. Pressed into the stone with a piece of iron, he shapes himself. Names. Dates. What happened to whom and when, and at whose hand. A record that no one was supposed to keep. A testimony that was never supposed to exist. And he is not finished yet. Not even close. Now, before we continue, we want to pause and ask you something personal. Do you have relatives or someone you know who lived through this era of American history? Who carried the weight of this painful period in their own family story? Subscribe to our channel and share in the comments below. This community grows stronger when we honor those who came before us. There is a particular kind of silence that is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of a choice. And in the house that stood 40 yards from the Whitmore Mill, a white-columned 2-story structure with a wide veranda that looked out over the Pearl River, that silence lived in every room, in every hallway, and most deeply of all, in the mind of a woman named Celeste. Celeste Beaumont Whitmore was born in New Orleans in 1819, the daughter of a French Creole merchant and his wife, a woman of considerable intelligence and very little happiness. She was educated at a private school for young women of the Catholic faith, where she studied literature, music, and the art of maintaining composure in difficult circumstances. She married Harlan Whitmore at the age of 22, in a ceremony that was described in the New Orleans Society pages as elegant and appropriate. She arrived in Mississippi 3 weeks later and understood, almost immediately, that she had made an irreversible mistake. Not because of the land, not because of the isolation, though the distance from New Orleans, from its music, its streets, its particular and irreplaceable energy, was a wound that never fully healed. But because of what she saw. Celeste Whitmore was not a naive woman. She had grown up in a city built on the same system, surrounded by the same brutal economics of human ownership. She was not arriving in Mississippi without knowledge of what slavery was. But there is a difference between knowing something in the abstract and watching it happen 20 feet from your kitchen window every morning before breakfast. She saw the punishments. She heard what happened in the outbuildings after dark. She knew the names of the women on the property who had no protection, no recourse, and no voice. And she knew exactly why they had none of those things. She knew, and she stayed. For years, she moved through the house and the property with the careful, measured composure she had been trained to maintain. She managed the domestic affairs of the household. She attended church on Sundays. She wrote letters to her sisters in New Orleans, letters that, in their surviving form, reveal almost nothing of what she was actually living through. Almost nothing, because there are other letters. Letters that were not sent. Letters that were discovered in 1961, more than 90 years after they were written, hidden behind a wooden panel on the second floor of the house, which by then had been converted into a municipal storage facility. A local historian named Dr. Ruth Haynes found them while cataloguing the building for a preservation survey. There were 41 letters in total, written between 1848 and 1861, addressed to a man identified only as E, and John believed to be a cousin of Celeste's, who had relocated to Chicago, and who held, based on the content of the correspondence, views on slavery that were dramatically different from those of Colonel Whitmore. In these letters, Celeste is a completely different woman. She writes with fury, with grief, with a specificity of detail that is, at times, almost unbearable to read. She describes what she witnesses. She names names. She records in her own careful handwriting incidents and events that would never appear in any official record of the Whitmore property. And in a letter dated March of 1857, she writes something that changes everything. She writes, "There is a man here who frightens me, not because of what he might do to me, but because of what they will do to him when they discover what he has been doing. He is the most intelligent person on this property, including my husband. His name is Solomon, and I believe with everything I have that he will not be here much longer if someone does not act." The hunters arrived in September of 1857. 3 men, hired by a neighboring landowner who had lost an enslaved person and believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that the Whitmore property was involved. They came with dogs and papers and the full casual authority of the law. They searched the property for 2 days. They did not find Solomon because Celeste had hidden him in a space beneath the floorboards of the house's back pantry, a space that no one knew existed except Celeste, who had discovered it accidentally 2 years earlier and had said nothing about it to her husband. Solomon spent 47 hours in complete silence and near total darkness. The hunters left on the 3rd morning. Celeste never told her husband what she had done. Solomon never spoke of it to anyone on the property. But from that September forward, something shifted between them. Not a friendship, not in any form that the world around them would have permitted or understood, but a kind of acknowledgement, a mutual recognition of what the other person was capable of. And it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough to change the course of what was coming. Today, Scotty, we want to stop here and ask you directly, what do you think of Celeste's choice? Was it courage, or was it too little, too late? And if your family lived in the American South during this period, on either side of this painful history, your story matters here. Subscribe to our channel and help us build a community that faces history with honesty and with courage. Doom. As by the spring of 1863, the world that Colonel Harlan Whitmore had built was beginning to come apart. The Civil War, which had begun 2 years earlier with a confidence among Southern leaders that it would be brief and decisive, was proving to be neither. Union forces had been moving steadily through the Mississippi Valley. The city of Vicksburg, the great Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, less than 100 miles to the west, was under siege. Supply lines were disrupted. The economy of the Deep South, built so entirely on the foundation of enslaved labor, was shaking at its roots. On the Whitmore property, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. People were paying attention to the war in ways they had not been permitted to pay attention to anything before. Word traveled through whispered conversations, through the movement of Union soldiers who sometimes passed within miles of the property, through fragments of newspapers left behind by visitors to the main house. And Solomon, who had spent 20 years learning to read in secret, understood every word. He had also, by this point, spent nearly 2 decades quietly doing something that required extraordinary patience, extraordinary discipline, and an acceptance of danger that most people, in any circumstance, in any era, would find impossible to sustain. He had been building trust, not with the Whitmores, not with the overseers, with the people around him. Over the years, he had become the person others came to when they needed to understand something, when they needed to think through a problem, when they needed to believe against all available evidence that there was a future worth surviving for. He never made promises he could not keep. He never asked anyone to take a risk he was not willing to take himself. And by the spring of 1863, 14 people on the Whitmore property had told Solomon, in one way or another, that when the moment came, they would follow him. The moment came on a Thursday night in April. The date is believed to be April 17, 1863, based on references in letters written afterward by Celeste Whitmore, who had, by this point, been living in a state of quiet, contained crisis for months, watching the war approach and knowing, with a certainty, she could not fully explain what was coming. That night, Colonel Whitmore retired early. He had been drinking more than usual in recent weeks, a fact noted by several members of the household, and by 9 in the evening, the house was quiet. At 11 o'clock, Solomon gathered the 14 people who had told him they would come. They did not run. This is the detail that every account of that night returns to, because it defies every expectation of what an escape looks like in the imagination. They walked, in a single file line, moving in deliberate silence through the darkness along the eastern bank of the Pearl River, carrying children in their arms and what little they possessed in cloth bundles on their backs. Solomon led from the front. They walked for 4 hours without stopping. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, they were far enough from the property that the dogs, which Whitmore would send out within hours, could not pick up a trail that had been deliberately, carefully broken at the river's edge. Harlan Whitmore woke on the morning of April 18th to a mill that was not running and a property that was, in the most essential sense, empty. He stood on his veranda for a long time. Those who saw him that morning said later that he did not shout, did not rage, did not immediately call for horses or hunters. He simply stood there, looking toward the river as if he was trying to understand something that his entire life had not prepared him to understand. The mill ran at a fraction of its capacity for the next 18 months. By the end of 1864, it had effectively stopped. Without the knowledge, the labor, and the skill of the people who had operated it for 2 decades, the machinery that Whitmore had built his identity around became, piece by piece, useless. He died in 1871, a diminished man, in a house that had fallen into visible disrepair. Celeste left Mississippi in the summer of 1863, 2 months after the night Solomon walked away. She went to New Orleans and from there eventually to Chicago, where her cousin E had been waiting in some form for years. She lived until 1894. She never spoke publicly about the Whitmore property or about anything she had witnessed there, but she kept the letters. And Solomon. Solomon was found, not lost, found because the distinction matters, living in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1869, working as a teacher at a school for children who, like him, had spent their lives being told that education was not for them. A journalist who interviewed him that year asked him what he remembered most about the night he left. He said he remembered the sound of the river. He said he remembered that it was quiet, and he said that the quiet felt, for the first time in his life, like it belonged to him. He died in Ohio in 1902 at the age of 80. He had taught for more than 30 years. He had a family. He had a home. He had a name that his students remembered. And in the interior wall of the Whitmore Mill, in the corner behind the large timber support beam on the ground floor, discovered during a structural survey in 1947, there were words pressed carefully into the stone in small, deliberate letters. Words that had been there for over 100 years. We were here. We built this. We are not forgotten. Before we close today, we want to ask you one final time. Do you know someone whose family carries a story like this? A story of survival, of resistance, of courage that history never officially recorded. Subscribe to our channel, share their name in the comments, say it out loud, let us remember them together, because that is the least and the most that we can do. And so we arrive at the end of Solomon's story. Or rather, we arrive at the end of the part of his story that we are able to tell today. Because the truth is that stories like this one do not end. They do not close neatly. They live in the walls of old buildings, in the handwriting of letters that were never meant to be found, in the names of people that official history chose not to write down. We want to hear from you. What did Solomon's walk in the darkness mean to you? What did Celeste's silence and her single act of courage make you feel? And what do you think we owe today to the people who built so much of this world and received so little in return? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective matters here. Subscribe to our channel. This is a space where history is treated with the weight it deserves, where the stories that were buried are brought back into the light, and where your voice is always welcome. And one thing we want to be clear about. This is a work of fiction, inspired by the real and extensively documented history of slavery in the American South. Solomon, Celeste, and Harlan Whitmore are fictional characters, but the suffering they represent, the resistance they embody, and the courage that carried 14 people through the darkness on an April night in 1863, that is not fiction. That is American history. Thank you, truly and deeply, for staying with us until the very end of this story. Your presence here means more than you know, and we promise you this: the best is still ahead. The next video is already waiting for you. And it carries a story just as powerful, just as human, and just as necessary as the one you just heard. Do not miss it.